Just about a year ago, I decided that I could get away with one bike to satisfy most, if not all, of my cycling needs. And this bike behind me, my gravel bike, is that bike. Or is it? Because I tend to be a little bit analytical, when I first started looking at this bike, I set up a number of use cases. In this video, I'll examine my cycling needs that were expressed in those use cases, and I'll take a look at those use cases to see whether this bike can satisfy my needs. I've made quite a lot of videos, and when those videos are appropriate, they will pop up in the top right-hand corner here.
Okay, I have three different use cases. Use case 1 is around day rides. Those are rides of normally 60 to 100 kilometers. Use case 2 would be something like Audax or long distance rides in one day. And use case 3, multi-day tours. I also had some generic requirements. I used these to select the frame and the components. So I think I pretty much hit all of those generic requirements. I first used this bike just about 9 months ago, and in that time I've covered about 6,000 kilometers in 81 activities. There were quite a few short rides where I was testing components, but there are also quite a lot of rides that corresponded to my day ride distance of around 60 to 100 kilometers. My longest ride was just over 200 kilometers in one day. My first use case was around day rides and club runs. Typically these would be up to about 100 kilometers. Because these rides were going to be a bit faster than I would normally do, I bought a special pair of carbon fiber 700C wheels. This is the bike with those wheels on and set up for this use case 1 or day ride mode. Overall, the bike worked pretty well for these type of rides, although that cheap Chinese saddle was not the best. Once I obtained my 650B wheels, which you'll see in the next section, I found myself liking them more than the carbon fiber wheels, so many of these rides were carried out with those 650B wheels. Why did I prefer those 650B wheels? I'm not sure. Perhaps I'll examine that in a future video. Anyway, let's move on to use case 2. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to ride Audax this year, so I haven't been able to fully test this use case. However, I have managed a number of rides of well over 100 kilometers and one of 208 kilometers. For these longer rides, I preferred my 650B wheels. For the shorter, fast Audax, I would probably use the 700C wheels. And I changed that cheap saddle for my Brooks C17. The relatively high-up aerodynamic style handlebars were great for relieving back discomfort and avoiding hand numbness. Those wider 650B tyres that I could run at lower pressures, and of course that Brooks saddle added to the overall comfort. Some Audax require mud guards, and I can fit these to either the 700C or the 650B version of the bike. The biggest downside of this setup became evident when I got to the hilly sections. The power of the mechanically actuated disc brakes was a bit lacking. The brakes were fine for the flatter day rides, but for the longer, steeper downhills I would have liked better brakes. Indeed, I've changed the original mechanically actuated hydraulic disc brakes for completely mechanical brakes. These have improved the situation, but even more braking power would be nice. Otherwise, the bike worked very well for these longer distance rides. I haven't had the opportunity to use this bike for multi-day tours. Despite that, I do have some concerns about using this gravel bike for that type of activity. However, let's start with the positive. As you can see in this picture, the bike has plenty of mounting points, which would allow me to take a reasonable amount of luggage. I can also fit the stronger 650B wheels, which will give extra resilience when the bike is loaded. Also, I find the bike comfortable to ride.
For shorter tours, like long weekends for instance, this bike could replace my touring bike that you can see now.
And as it's lightweight and more aerodynamic, it'll probably ride faster. especially if fitted with bike packing bags.
However, having said that, I don't tend to go on my tours to go fast. And now I think I ought to go through some of the problems that I would have with this bike in terms of particularly those longer tours. First of all, these internal cables. Although they look neat and are aerodynamic, as if I had a problem with one of those cables on a long tour, getting it repaired or repairing it myself would be extremely difficult. And indeed I have had a problem with one of those cables, and even repairing it at home was quite a task. So for that one reason, I probably wouldn't take this bike on a longer tour. I mentioned bike packing bags. Well, currently I don't have any bike packing bags, so if I wanted to use this for bike packing or light touring, I would have to buy some bike packing bags. I'd also be concerned about how much stuff I could fit into those bike packing bags. I personally would want more flexibility around that. Also, when this bike is fitted with all those bike packing bags and the luggage, I'd be a little concerned about its robustness. It being carbon fibre, if it received a nasty knock, which it could receive when going on a longer tour, then the damage to it could mean the end of that tour. Another reason for not taking this on a longer tour would be the bike, I think, could be quite attractive to people that don't currently own it. And that's another reason I think I'd prefer to take my much older Tatiya touring bike that you can see here. It's less attractive to the light-handed, and personally I don't want to end my touring holiday by having my bike stolen. Earlier I did mention that the brakes on here weren't as powerful as I would like them to be, and I think once this was loaded up, those brakes may not be up to the rigours of touring. Of course I could put hydraulic disc brakes on here, but again for touring I'm not sure that hydraulic's the best option. If they get damaged out on the road, repair of those could be difficult. So I would like to stick to a more traditional touring bike with rim brakes. I've taken a look at my different use cases, so now it's time to sum up. Well, my first use case was around day rides, and effectively what I'm saying is, can this gravel-based bike replace a road bike? And for me the answer is yes, it can. In fact, it already has. My giant Defy that you can see here has already been sold, and I've been using this bike instead. Obviously, for those day rides I can set it up in a day ride mode with those 700C wheels and lighter weight components. I've also put my power meter on for some of the rides. So I can reconfigure this to make a good road bike, at least for me. I suspect if you are racing, then a very small weight penalty of less than a kilogram or 1% of the total rider and bike weight, and the slightly inferior aerodynamics might be important, but for me, and probably for the majority of cyclists, that is almost totally irrelevant. So although my bike count went up by 1, it's now gone back down by another 1 as well. My second use case was around those longer day rides such as Audax. Now this bike is probably better suited to that use case, and indeed when I was designing and buying the parts I was thinking more of that than I was the other 2 use cases. So can this bike work for those longer day rides and Audax? Again the answer is yes, and this bike has replaced the one that you can see here, which is the bike I was previously using for those longer day rides and Audax. As for my third use case, that is multi-day rides where I'll want to be carrying luggage, I have some more reservations about this bike. So I'll be keeping my touring bike. Firstly, it's unlikely to get stolen. Secondly, it's much more robust. Thirdly, it's much easier to repair on the road. And lastly, I personally prefer more traditional luggage solutions. I like the brick aerodynamics of traditional panniers. They also have a lot more room in them, and I find them easier to use. So I'll be keeping my touring bike and not using this bike for those multi-day tours. I haven't got down to my aim of using one bike for all of my cycling needs. I'm retaining 2 bikes. This bike for everything but those longer multi-day tours, for which I'll be using my touring bike. Now for me that's not a bad outcome, because if I have a problem with my one bike solution, and I did have a problem with this, with the gear cables breaking, I would have no other bike to ride. Of course, there is another use case that I didn't consider when I started this project. As I've got a gravel bike, I could actually use it for some light off-road work. And in fact, I actually have done that. Now, I haven't been doing long off-road sections. They tend to be shortcuts and cut-throughs on road rides. But having the extra robustness and the tyres and wheels that are better suited to off-road, for me, is a bonus. I'm sure there are other use cases that I could invent, but I'm going to stop there. There is a twist at the end of this tale, and for that I need to just tell you a bit of my history. Just about 5 years ago, I had a medical condition that has affected my ability to cycle. That condition has stayed with me over the last 5 years, and although things have improved, from time to time I have a relapse. And recently I had such a relapse. That meant that I couldn't ride any of the 2 bikes that I had remaining. So while I was feeling sorry for myself, I started looking around to find solutions that would help me get back onto the road. Now this coincides with my general interest in the technology of e-bikes. So while I was at low ebb, I weakened and I bought an e-bike. The upshot is I've gone from owning 3 bikes to owning 3 bikes. Anyway, in future videos I'll tell you a bit more about my e-bike, and perhaps at a later date I'll update you about this one bike solution. From me, for now, it's goodbye. Well, I've got something here that looks a bit like a bike box. It smells like a bike box, and it feels like a bike box. Perhaps it's got a bike in. What does it say on the front? Trek. Trek, huh? That's intriguing.